Chapter 5. Up in John's hotel suite, Deidre asked the concierge to find her some origami paper in a variety of colors. While they waited for it, she decided to give Lacey a call.
"Girls, I need to make a phone call," Deidre said. "I'm going to step out onto the lanai, okay?"
Both girls nodded as if it were no big deal. So Deidre took her phone and headed across the threshold of the sliding glass door, closing it behind her. She sat down in the nearest chair and set the call, waiting anxiously for Lacey to answer. When she heard Lacey's voice, Deidre said,
"You'll never guess where I am."
Lacey responded with a hint of caution.
"Where?" "In his suite."
"Whose?" Lacey's interest perked up.
"Not the hot dad?" "That's the one."
Deidre could barely contain the excitement fueling her heart, even though she knew being here was a bad idea. The guy was probably married, and Deidre was destined for a broken heart.
"So he's not married?"
"I don't know."
"What do you mean you don't know? You haven't asked?"
More dead silence. The direction of this call could go either way, good or bad.
"Why are you in his suite, and where are his children?"
"It's weird," Deidre said. "I ran into them down at the beach today. As it turned out, John's assistant and his wife were nearby, too."
"The assistant and his wife?"
Lacey's tone calmed.
"Chances are he paid for their vacation, too, so it's not likely that he'll turn out to be a scoundrel."
"I've already thought of that," Deidre admitted.
"I think he's got plenty of money."
Lacey's voice was filled with intrigue when she said, "Well, he's staying at Trump. We had lunch here today, and the staff pretty much bends over backward to cater to him."
"His assistant staying at Trump, too?"
"Yes," Deidre nodded.
"Then, as Tasha would say, the guy is loaded."
Lacey let out with a little laugh.
"Good. At least we don't have to worry that he's after your money."
"No, I just have to worry about where the hell his wife is."
"Which brings us back to the question, what are you doing there?" "Philip, his assistant, had a heart attack. John is at the hospital. He didn't want to take the girls, so I'm here with them."
Deidre summed it up easily, but there was nothing easy about it. She was starting to really like this guy, and that, she knew, could and probably would lead to disaster.
"It's weird that this guy, his kids, his assistant, and the assistant's wife are all in Hawaii," Lacey said. "But there's no wife in sight for the father of 2 children."
"Tell me about it."
"So you're at the suite, alone with the kids?"
"Yes."
"Boys? Girls? How old are they?"
"Girls. They're 9 and 12, I think they said."
"Oh, hell! Go out there and ask one of those girls where their mother is."
I will. Deidre's tone wasn't nearly as confident as her words.
"Great. Now you call me back later and let me know what they said." "But it'll be too late there. You'll be asleep." "Then call me in the morning."
"Okay." Deidre looked over her shoulder. The girls were sitting on the couch. Amy had the television remote in her hands, and she and Emily appeared to be arguing about something, probably the remote control.
"I'd better go. I'll call you tomorrow."
"Okay.
Go find out. Bye."
And with that, the call ended. Deidre went back inside, and the girls stopped talking, arguing, or whatever they were doing.
"Was that my dad?"
Emily asked.
"No."
Deidre shook her head.
"A friend of mine back in California. She's very pregnant with twins and trying to live vicariously through me right now."
"Twins?" Amy said distastefully and glared at Emily.
"Believe me, 1 baby at a time is plenty."
Uh-oh. The last thing Deidre wanted was for Amy and Emily to start fighting again.
"Hey,"
Deidre dropped onto the couch between the girls.
"Let's find something to watch on TV until the origami paper gets here."
She nodded enthusiastically at them. They each relented slowly. Emily first, then Amy. The 3 of them settled in while Amy channel surfed. Within half an hour, a bountiful supply of origami papers in a variety of colors was delivered. 2 hours later, Deidre had demonstrated and helped the girls create half a dozen different flowers, and the fruits of their efforts were scattered all over the table. Some folds were better than others, but Deidre wasn't judging. She was just enjoying hanging out with Amy and Emily.
"Miss Deidre,"
Emily looked up at her.
"when is my daddy coming back?"
"Well," Deidre sucked in a breath, buying time to find the best response.
"I'm sure he'll be back as soon as he can."
Emily's face melded into a distressed expression.
"Miss Deidre."
Her voice trailed off as she waited to command Deidre's full attention. Once she had it, she continued.
"I'm hungry."
"Oh, my God!" Deidre chastised herself. Why hadn't she thought the children might be hungry? And to think John had entrusted their care to her. Well, no matter. She could easily fix it.
"Shall we order room service?" she suggested. "Do you know where the menu is?"
Emily nodded and ran to the desk on the other side of the couch, where she grabbed a brown binder and trotted back to the dining table. Deidre's cell chimed. She glanced at the display. It was John.
"I need to take this," she said, standing up. "You girls go over the menu and decide what you want. We'll order just as soon as I finish this call."
Once they both nodded, Deidre stepped away from the table and moved out onto the lanai, closing the sliding door behind her.
"Hey," she said into the phone. "How is Philip?" "He's hanging in there."
There was a brief pause, then John added, "Can the girls hear you? They don't know, do they?"
"No." Deidre shook her head as she spoke. "I stepped out onto the lanai to take your call."
"Thank you," he said, and she could practically hear the relief pouring out in his sigh. "And I'm sorry about all this."
"Don't worry about it, and don't worry about us. The girls and I are doing fine. In fact, we're about to order dinner. They're perusing the room service menu as we speak."
She wanted him to know she had everything under control, that she could take care of his children. He could count on her.
"Thank you,
and be sure to charge it to the room."
"Will do," she said softly.
"I'll try to get back as soon as I can," he said. "But if you need me to come back right away, I will."
"No."
Deidre shook her head.
"You stay there as long as you need to. I'm sure you're a great comfort to Helen."
"I would like to stay until the test results come back. It should be within the hour."
"No problem. I'll make up some story to tell the girls."
"I'm sorry to put you in a position where you have to lie to Amy and Emily, but I don't want them to know about Philip just yet." There was another long pause. "I have a very good reason, and I will tell you about it when I see you."
"Don't worry," she assured him. "I won't lie. I'll just play dumb."
That got a laugh out of him. "Deidre, I'm sorry if I've ruined your vacation." She thought about it for a moment, and then said, with a hint of laughter,
"You'll make it up to me."
"You can count on it," he said smoothly. "Do you mind if I speak with the girls briefly?"
"Oh, sure. Hang on and I'll get them."
Deidre opened the sliding door and went back inside.
"It's your dad," she said, handing the phone to Amy.
After a few brief moments of talking to each of the girls, Emily handed the phone back to Deidre with a pouty look on her face.
"He says I gotta take a bath."
She perched her hands on her hips.
"Can you do that alone?"
Deidre asked, nearly scared out of her wits. She'd never been in the position to have to bathe a child. She'd never even seen it done. Emily rolled her eyes and nodded.
"Don't be rude, Em," Amy said. "Deidre's been very nice to us."
Deidre sucked in a breath to hide the shock as she turned to Amy. She wasn't expecting that. The turnaround in Amy's behavior from just a couple of days ago was nothing short of miraculous. Deidre marveled at the quickness of it.
"Sorry, Miss Deidre."
Emily batted her eyes.
"It's fine, Emily," she assured her. "But perhaps you should take a quick bath before room service is delivered."
Deidre presented it to her as a suggestion, so she'd feel like she had a choice in the matter.
"All right,"
Emily nodded.
"Would you order me one of those chicken wrap thingies?"
She waited until Deidre acknowledged her request, then trotted off toward one of the bedrooms. Deidre and Amy perused the room service menu until they decided on selections. Once Deidre had placed their order, she returned to the dining table, where Amy was still sitting, playing with the origami flowers they'd made.
"So when is my dad coming back?"
she asked, after Deidre sat down.
"He said he's almost done, and it shouldn't take too much longer."
She kept her response vague and non-committal. Amy peered at the pink flower in her hand as if she were inspecting it.
"I'll bet it has something to do with my mother,"
she said solemnly. Deidre's heart shriveled.
"Why would you think that?"
Were they expecting her? Was John's wife the one who was destined to ruin Deidre's vacation?
"There's something you don't know,"
Amy said.
"Tell me about it."
Deidre gave herself a mental kick for letting herself get too attached to John and his daughters, and so quickly, too.
"It's about why we're in Hawaii."
There was a sadness radiating from Amy, one Deidre couldn't quite put her finger on. Perhaps she was just missing her mother and was ready for her to join them to make the family complete. Boy, did she ever feel like a third wheel. Then Deidre remembered why she was in Hawaii. That showered her with sadness.
"If you want to share,"
Deidre said, simply to get her mind off her own troubles,
"I want to listen." "I'll bet my dad is making arrangements for Sunday."
Sunday? Oh, God! Was Amy's mother, John's wife, joining them on Sunday?
"Is that when your mother arrives?"
It was none of Deidre's business, but she had to ask. For her own sanity, she had to know if this woman was going to come in and rip away every shred of dignity that Deidre had. When her eyes drifted back to Amy, the child had a horrified look on her face. Tears slipped from Amy's eyes before she muttered,
"She's already here."
"Huh?" was all Deidre could manage. Amy pointed to an exotic-looking canister sitting on the kitchen counter that Deidre hadn't noticed before. It was beautiful, with butterflies in various shades of blue and purple that seemed to be fluttering over a bed of deep blue flowers. The entire scene was overlain on gold. Deidre quickly realized the canister was an urn. Deidre's heart ached with sadness, then sympathy, and finally shame that quickly spiraled into guilt over the sliver of relief that had cut its way into her heart, knowing that Amy's mother was not going to show up to claim her family.
"Oh, God, Amy, I'm so sorry."
Deidre's voice cracked as she bit back the urge to cry.
"I had no idea."
Amy hung her head as tears spilled from her eyes. She began to jerk with her sobs. Instantly, Deidre was out of her chair, on her knees, and pulling the girl into her arms. After a few moments of clinging to Deidre, Amy swiped at her tears and tried to smile.
"I shouldn't let Emily see me cry,"
she said, pulling away from Deidre and scooting back into her chair. Deidre moved back to her own chair.
"I'll tell you a secret."
Amy looked at her with interest, but didn't say anything.
"I came here to scatter my parents' ashes."
Deidre's tone was solemn. Amy's eyes widened.
"Really?"
Deidre nodded.
"They passed away 3 months ago. Car accident. My mom had cancer."
The thought of John having to watch his wife die of cancer sucker-punched Deidre's heart. The thought of Amy and Emily having to witness it shattered her badly bruised heart into pieces.
"How long has it been since your mother passed away?"
Deidre asked, thinking it must have been recently. She had no business getting mixed up with a family in mourning.
3 years.
3 years? Deidre felt her mouth falling open and snapped it shut. She sucked in a breath.
"Oh, my."
Her words trailed off as she searched for something to say, some words of comfort, yet trying to understand how John and his children had been left hanging in limbo for so long.
"Yeah."
Amy almost laughed.
"My dad's had a hard time letting go. That's what my Uncle Ray says."
A knock at the door eased the tension.
"Uncle Ray may be on to something,"
Deidre said, pushing herself up from the table. Thank goodness the food was here. Hopefully, by the time they'd eaten, John would return and Deidre could be on her way. This was a situation she didn't need to get mixed up in. Well, at least not any more than she already was. Now that she realized the true nature of the situation she was in, she had to extract herself from it, quickly. John Sinclair stepped out of the limo and strolled through the Trump Tower's open portico toward the elevators. He'd been so afraid that Philip would not survive the heart attack, but after receiving preliminary tests, the doctors assured John and Helen that Philip would indeed survive. He would, however, have to spend the next week in the hospital. The entire party was scheduled to return home long before Philip would be released from the hospital, and then surely he would need rest before he could even consider getting on an airplane. John went to the lobby on the 6th floor, explained the situation to the woman at the registration desk, and extended Helen and Philip's room through a week from Friday. By then, surely he'd be able to bring the jet back to Hawaii to retrieve them. The elevator doors slid open. John stepped inside, swiped his room's card key, and hit number 28. The elevator traversed the floors swiftly. John stepped off the lift and headed down the hallway toward his suite. He would have to find a way to make it up to Deidre for asking her to pretty much lie to his children about his whereabouts. It wasn't exactly an out-and-out lie, but rather a lie by omission. At this point, the line between the two had blurred. He felt a little bad about it, but he would have felt worse upon seeing his children's faces, knowing Philip had been taken to the hospital. The last time they'd heard someone had been taken to the hospital, their mother, she didn't come home. John paused at the door to his suite and willed himself to remain calm in front of the children. Confident in his ability, he swiped the card key and opened the door. Emily hopped up from the dining table.
"Daddy!"
She ran to him.
"We had so much fun with Miss Deidre."
She latched onto his hand and led him toward the table.
"Look at the pretty flowers we made."
Paper flowers in a variety of colors had been bunched together in the center of the table, probably when room service arrived. Near empty plates occupied the perimeter. Amy and Deidre glanced up at John.
"Hey, Dad,"
Amy said. Deidre smiled at him, and his heart melted. John surveyed the table as a distraction to keep him from making a fool of himself by staring at Deidre.
"I trust you girls didn't give Deidre too much of a hassle."
Both girls groaned, but Deidre moved in swiftly.
"Amy and Emily were perfect companions this evening. I doubt I could have had a better time anywhere else."
"That's very generous of you." John chuckled, knowing Deidre's proclamation was most likely an embellishment of the truth. His children, especially Amy, hadn't been perfect in a long time.
"Dad,"
Amy stood.
"the fireworks are going to start soon. Can Miss Deidre stay and watch them with us?"
"I wouldn't want to intrude," Deidre spoke up.
"Of course, you must stay,"
John said, trying not to beg.
"We'd be honored to have you watch them with us. Our balcony has a perfect view."
"Well," Deidre sighed, "if you're sure it's not an imposition, I'd love to stay and watch."
"Then it's settled."
John clapped his hands together.
"Should we order some dessert?"
After much deliberation, choices were made, dessert was ordered, and delivered in a timely fashion. On the lanai, John and Deidre both indulged in a glass of wine, while the four of them dined on chocolate crunch, a chocolate mousse with wafers, and Tuscan chocolate bread pudding, while watching the fireworks show. When the grandeur of the finale faded away, Deidre moved to the edge of her chair.
"Thank you for inviting me to stay for the show. It was spectacular."
She looked specifically at John.
"I hope all of your business works out in your favor."
Deidre pushed herself up from the chair, and Amy leaned toward John and whispered,
"Dad, can't we invite her to lunch tomorrow or something? Don't you owe her for tonight?"
Amy was right, and she had obviously taken a liking to Deidre. Truth be told, so had John. How could he not like a woman who'd been the means to transform his bear of a daughter back into this sweet, lovable, agreeable girl she'd once been, before her mother's death? A wave of guilt splashed over John as he stood, but he called after her anyway. "Deidre?" She glanced over her shoulder as she stepped across the threshold of the sliding door. She stiffened when her eyes met his smile. "The girls and I would like it very much if you would join us for lunch tomorrow. We've planned a trip to the North Shore, Turtle Bay. They've got a great little restaurant that overlooks the beach there." He was rambling now, something he hadn't done since his crush on Robin Thompson back in high school. "That's really not necessary," she said. "I was happy to hang out with the girls this evening. We had a great time. Lots of fun." She was courteous enough, but John got the feeling she was trying to distance herself. But why? "Please join us. It would be our pleasure." The thought of her walking out of his life made his heart pound erratically against his chest. Emily rushed to Deidre's side, hugging her. "Please, Miss Deidre." She glanced up and gave her that look, the one that John had rarely been able to deny. Deidre brushed Emily's hair back out of her face. "All right." She agreed, but her tone had been reluctant. She looked back at John. "If you're sure I won't be intruding." "Positive," John said. "We'd love to have you join us." "All right." She nodded, but John got the feeling that she still had her reservations. She hurried to the door, so fast he was barely able to catch up to her before he'd stepped into the hallway. She stopped once outside the room, as if the threshold was a safety barrier. "I'll see you all tomorrow, then." John said, "We'll call for you at the Embassy Suites around 10. "Sounds good. I'll wait by the entrance." She nodded and turned away. "Good night, Deidre." She waved over her shoulder without looking back. "Good night." John closed the door. He was filled with thoughts of what might have happened to cause her to want to distance herself from him and the girls. What had happened while he was at the hospital? He went to find Amy. The girls were in their bedroom. Emily was already lounging on the bed, channel surfing. Amy was in the bathroom. John walked across the room and tapped on the bathroom door. "Amy?" "Yeah," she said, behind the sounds of sloshing water. "When you're done, let's talk." "Okay." Her garbled reply echoed through the door. John headed back toward the door leading into the living room. Moments later, Amy padded out with Emily tagging along. "What did you all do this evening?" he asked in as nonchalant a voice as possible. The girls hung out near the doorway leading to their bedroom. "We made origami flowers," Emily said. "And had dinner," Amy shrugged. "What did you talk about?" Nerves were starting to rattle his voice. Amy glanced at Emily and said, "Nothing much. Deidre seemed a little upset when she left." John peered at the girls, waiting for signs of guilt from either of them. None came. "Honest," Emily said. "We had a good time with Miss Deidre." Amy shot John a supportive look. "Maybe tomorrow you can ask her if we did or said something to upset her." But there was no guilt in Amy's voice, only hope. Yes, tomorrow John would have to find out why Deidre had become so suddenly distant. She had at least agreed to lunch with them tomorrow, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 6. The next morning, Deidre was up at 5:30, knowing Lacey was probably pacing the floor, wanting an update about John's marital status. Truth be told, Deidre was more than anxious to share what she'd learned from Amy last night. After a quick shower, she powered on her cell phone and set a call to California.
"Deidre!"
Lacey's feisty voice echoed through the phone.
"I was about to call you since I hadn't heard from you yet this morning."
"Well, technically it's still bedtime here. It's only a few minutes off to 6. Lacey was silent for a bit, and Deidre could see her checking her watch.
"Oh, that's right. You're 3 hours behind me."
"It is a bit of an inconvenience, isn't it?" Deidre laughed.
"So, what happened?" Lacey asked. "Did you ask one of the daughters?" "Yes, I did," Deidre nodded. "And what I found out kind of sucks for them." Feelings of sadness wrapped around Deidre. "What? What?" Lacey's voice had taken on an impatient tone. "His wife is dead." Deidre filled with guilt over the tiny bit of joy that had sprung up in a remote corner of her heart the moment she learned that John wasn't married. She shouldn't be happy about someone being dead. "Dead?" Lacey's tone echoed the same sentiment. "This couldn't have worked out better." "Lacey," Deidre objected. "Well, I'm only saying what we're both thinking. There's no ex-wife to interfere." "Just the dead wife's ghost." Lacey snorted a laugh. "Come on, you don't believe in ghosts?" "Not a physical ghost, just a symbolic one." "Oh, come on, Deidre," Lacey scolded her. "You're a vibrant young woman with as much beauty and charm as you have money, to burn, I might add. Any man would be lucky to have you." I know. I'm no longer that mousy little girl who was in love with your brother Andre several years ago." Deidre knew that to be true, but that same scared little girl still resided deep within Deidre, and she didn't have a problem rearing her mousy little head every now and then. "Hey, remember Jeff Barnes?" Lacey asked with a devilish chuckle. Jeff was an acquaintance of Nick Matthews, Lacey's husband. Lacey and Nick had introduced Deidre and Jeff a few months before Lacey found out she was expecting. Deidre was the first to admit that it had been fun sporting around L.A. on the arm of the drop-dead gorgeous man, but after a few weeks the appeal had worn off. Jeff wasn't her type. All the girls, and a few guys too, who were constantly fawning all over Jeff didn't bother Deidre. The fact that he was as conceited as the day is long didn't bother her either. What bothered Deidre was his constant need to be touchy-feely with her, and his constant need to talk to her on the phone 15 times a day. She couldn't stand the clinginess that came with this gorgeous man who wanted to occupy every waking moment of her day. Yes, I remember Jeff Barnes. And she'd just as soon forget him. "I've got to go," she said. "I'm having lunch on the North Shore with John and the girls." "Lunch, huh?" Lacey's mischievous tone poured through the phone. "You don't seem to mind spending all of your time with John and his kids." Deidre didn't need Lacey reminding her of the reason she dumped Jeff Barnes. The two scenarios weren't the same. They weren't even in the same ballpark. This time it was different. "Well, for as much as I think it's a bad idea to get mixed up with a widower and his kids, spending time with them just seems like the most natural thing in the world. Sounds like fate to me." Hola! The beachside restaurant at Turtle Bay was semi-crowded, but John, Deidre, and the girls had managed to get a table near the edge of the patio, yet not down on the sand. Deidre was thankful for that. Her shoes were open-toed, but not sandals, and the last thing she wanted to do was set her tender feet down into the coarse Oahu sand in that kind of shoe. As soon as the girls finished their burgers and fries, they took off for the water's edge. John and Deidre stayed at the table, while John kept a watchful eye on the girls. A gentle breeze drifted past Deidre. The temperatures, since she'd been here, were perfect. It was neither cold nor hot. She liked it. No wonder her parents had been so fond of it. Funny that they'd never brought her here. Maybe it was their place. And now, after Sunday, when she scattered their ashes just offshore, it would be their place forever. A sense of melancholy whipped past her as she watched the waves battering the shore. The waters here were far different than the lazy, gentle waves of Waikiki. For as much as she enjoyed relaxing on the beach at Waikiki, there was something to be said for the turmoil and the crushing waves of the North Shore. It kind of matched the turbulent feelings overpowering her right now. She glanced at John, remembering what Amy had told her last night. He was in Hawaii for the same reason that Deidre was. Pretty much. She wished he would confide in her, talk to her about his wife's death. It would make her feel better about spending so much time with him and his children. But really, what does one say? Hey, did I tell you my wife died? Not exactly a proper subject when you're trying to get to know someone. If he was indeed trying to get to know her. But surely he must be, right? Why else would he keep insinuating himself upon her, or making it so easy for her to intrude upon him? "Thanks for inviting me today," she said. "It's beautiful here." She knew it was a bad idea to get mixed up with John, considering why he was in Hawaii. The only thing worse than finding out a guy was married was finding out you're competing with his dead wife's ghost. "Only because you're here." He raised his beer in a salute. Deidre squirmed in her chair. She wasn't used to being flirted with, especially by such a handsome man. "My compliment makes you uncomfortable?" he asked. "I'm not really used to this kind of attention." She dipped her chin and tried stealing a glimpse of him. "I find that really hard to believe. A woman as beautiful as you?" He shook his head and peered at her. "I can't imagine why you're here in this paradise all alone." "There's a very good reason for that." "Not to mention a depressing one." Deidre gulped her wine. She could tell him why she was here. That should make it easy for him to tell her about his wife. But she wanted him to tell her because he wanted to, not because she had opened the door for him. "But I don't want to bore you." "That'll never happen," he laughed. She pointed toward the water. "The girls look like they're having fun." "That they are," he nodded. "And I owe it all to you." "Me?" she asked. "The difference in their demeanor since we arrived are like night and day." He waved at Deidre elaborately. "I can only attribute it to you." Deidre laughed. "That's very kind of you." John looked out at the girls frolicking along the water's edge. His gaze lingered on them. When he turned back to Deidre, his smile slowly faded. "Deidre, I think there's something I should tell you." He swirled the beer around in its bottle. "Okay," she said cautiously. Was he going to tell her about his wife? She hoped so. For some reason, and she didn't know why, it felt like if he brought up the subject first, it had meant he wanted to open up to her, like he was ready to move on. "I hope I'm not mistaken," she thought. "I'll admit," he said, "I didn't expect to end up having such a good time on this trip." "Neither did I." She almost felt guilty about it, considering what she'd come here to do. But wasn't having fun what her parents had wanted for her? John fidgeted in his chair, raked his fingers through his blond hair, then cleared his throat. He glanced back out at the girls again. "This is not supposed to be a vacation in the traditional sense." He looked back at Deidre. "We came here to spread my wife's ashes. She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. John, I'm very sorry." Those old feelings of uncertainty that she wasn't good enough, pretty enough, deserving enough, began to resurface. Deidre sucked in a breath. "See, I was afraid I was intruding." Her words trailed off as she laid her forehead in her hand. "But that's just it." His hand gently caressed her arm. It was the first time he'd touched her. On purpose. "You're not intruding. At least I don't think you are. The girls don't think you are." John went silent as he looked at Deidre with approval gleaming in his ebony eyes. "Yes, but I'm clearly making you uncomfortable." "I just don't want you to think poorly of me." John reached for Deidre's hand. She couldn't object. Hope tugged a smile at the corners of her mouth. She began shaking her head. "That'll never happen." "So you don't think badly of me for enjoying our time together, even though I'm here to fulfill my late wife's last wishes?" Overcome with her own dose of guilt, Deidre sucked in a breath. Hopefully it was more courage than cowardice. "There's something you should know." she pushed herself to say. She gazed at him for a lingering moment before she continued. I'm here for the same reason you are. Sort of. Really? John's eyes widened. He squeezed her hand. Your husband passed away? No, she shook her head. My parents. Both of them? Deidre nodded. A car accident about 3 months ago. John gazed around at their surroundings, paused momentarily on the girls, who were now sitting at the water's edge, and then settled his sights on Deidre. Maybe this is fate. Fate. That's the same thing Lacey had said on the phone just this morning. Deidre found herself caught up in John's eyes. She was locked in their intensity, couldn't pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. Well, it is something my parents would try to orchestrate. Her words trailed off as she filled with embarrassment that allowed her to break the spell. Jessica, too. He waited until Deidre looked at him again, then said, Deidre, I can't tell you how sorry I am about your parents. Thank you. Deidre tightened her mouth to keep from tearing up. Well, she looked back out at the girls, playing once again in the water. I understand Amy and Emily a lot better now. It's hard to lose your mother at any age. She looked back at John. But as young as they are, that's awful. Yeah, he nodded. I might have indulged them a little too much since Jessica's death, especially Amy. I'm sure you've been an exemplary father, Deidre said. They're wonderfully sweet and warm-hearted children. Thanks to you, John laughed. I think you're giving me a little too much credit. She felt the heat of a blush crawling up her neck. The glory is most likely due to this beautiful island paradise, I'm sure. John studied Deidre for what seemed like forever. His gaze told her that he wanted to hold her, kiss her. At least that's the way he made her feel. And she wanted to be in his arms, to feel his lips against hers. John broke into her thoughts, saying, The girls and I are going to a luau Friday night at Paradise Cove. Would you like to join us? Are you sure? Absolutely. Do you think we can get an extra ticket at your table? No need. I have 2 extras. Philip and Helen were scheduled to go with us, but with Philip in the hospital, that won't happen now. Deidre thought about it. Okay, under one condition. She waited for him to respond. He said, Agreed. Agreed? You don't even know what the condition is. Don't need to, he grinned. As long as you're involved, I'm all for it. Deidre laughed and shook her head. You're incorrigible. Just so I know, what is it I've signed up for? I have a 4-person table reserved for a dinner cruise on the Star of Honolulu tomorrow evening. I'd like you and the girls to accompany me. You booked a 4-person table for yourself? I didn't want to sit beside strangers. He nodded, as if he understood. Well, now you won't have to. You'll be dining with me and my somewhat civil children. They both laughed. Deidre almost forgot what had brought her, John, and his children to Hawaii in the first place. Chapter 7. On the dinner cruise, Amy and Emily couldn't have been more obvious when they asked to sit together on the back side of the table, leaving John on the outside next to Deidre. But he didn't mind. Sitting next to Deidre was a pleasure. She wore a dress that she'd probably bought in one of the shops along the beach walk. It was black with blue flowers and spaghetti straps. She looked incredibly beautiful, but John got the feeling she didn't know it. He leaned toward her and whispered against her ear, Have I told you how nice you look this evening? He'd thought about saying beautiful or stunning, but decided against it. Telling her how beautiful she looked might not come across well, considering he'd just met her a couple of days ago, and he was here to scatter his wife's ashes. Thank you, she blushed, then reached for her water goblet. John glanced at the girls. They were giggling and whispering to each other. At least they were having fun. He turned back to Deidre. Have you lived in the States long?" It didn't seem like an out-of-order question, since her accent was clearly anything but American. She took a second or two to think about it. "Couple of years, although I spent quite a bit of time in Florida when I was growing up. That's where my grandmother lived. My dad was an American." "And your mother?" "France." "Ah, that's it." He'd thought he'd detected a hint of a French accent wrapped around her Queen's English. "France. Is that where you grew up?" She nodded. "I did spend a lot of time in England, boarding schools." "Any plans to return to France?" "Not really." Deidre shook her head. "My parents and my best friend Lacey were my ties to France. As you know, my parents are gone, and Lacey lives in California now." Deidre shrugged it off as if France no longer had any meaning for her. "So you're pretty much resigned to stay in California to be near the one person you have left?" She nodded. At least California was close to Nevada, closer than Florida or France, close enough that she could easily pay a visit to her friend whenever she wanted. John was shocked at the thoughts running through his head. A future with Deidre? When had he opened up to that possibility? Apparently his mind had already decided it, and was just now cluing him in. "Well, I do hope you'll promise to come visit us in northern Nevada." He put it out there to see how she'd react. She stared at him blankly, and he set about turning on the charm. "It would be a shame if the end of this trip were the end of our acquaintance." Deidre hesitated, but only briefly, then asked, "What's it like where you live? I've only been to Tahoe with Lacey and her sister-in-law." "Well, it's isolated." The thought that she might not find that agreeable seeped out in his tone. "Hawaii's isolated, too." "Yes, but things are pretty quiet around Whisper Lake. That's the little town near my family's ranch. It's not exactly a jet-setter's paradise." "Whisper Lake," she said with a gentle softness. "Sounds like paradise to me." "I think so." "And a ranch?" Her blue eyes brightened. "You have horses?" "Yes, we do," he said. "Do you ride?" "I love horseback riding." "If you come for a visit, I promise horseback riding across gorgeous terrain and a picnic along the shore of Whisper Lake." "That's very tempting," she said. "Then you'll come?" "Sure. Why not?" She glanced at Amy and Emily. "Think they'll be okay with a visit from me?" "They'll be more than okay with it." Her mood shifted into one of melancholy as she said, "You must have had an idyllic childhood." "It wasn't all fun and games, but it did have its charms." He shook his head and laughed heartily as memories from his childhood invaded his thoughts. He and his siblings had played football and baseball in the yard, hide-and-go-seek on horseback, and spent a lot of time simply roaming the woods. "My brothers and sisters and I were very good at occupying our time when we were kids." "How many siblings do you have?" "4." He held up the magic number of fingers, and then pared them down to 2 as he added, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. "Wow." Deidre went silent for a moment, like she was trying to process being part of such a large family. "And where do you fall into place among them?" "The middle," he said. "There's Ray, he's the oldest, then my sister Lori, I'm next, then my little sister Dana, and the baby of the bunch is Justin. He knows how to take advantage of his position." John laughed. "They have children?" "No." John shook his head. "They're all single, no children." The girls, obviously, hadn't had any children, but he couldn't vouch for his brothers, not completely. "None that I'm aware of, anyway." A young woman with a camera stopped at their table. "Souvenir pics? They come with your dinner package." Her gaze jumped back and forth between John and Deidre, assuming they were a family. "Oh, please!" Emily clapped. "Can we?" Deidre looked at John and shrugged. "Why not?" "Let's have the girls come stand behind Mom and Dad." The photographer pointed to the girls and motioned them behind John and Deidre. John thought about correcting the girl, but it might prove embarrassing for Deidre. He didn't want that, so he left it alone. Instead, he nodded for Amy and Emily to follow the photographer's lead. The girls went to stand behind John and Deidre, while the photographer slid into a seat at the now unoccupied side of the table. She snapped 2 pictures, then moved on to the next table. Amy and Emily returned to their seats, and the remainder of the evening was filled with laughter and enjoyment. Just before the ship returned to harbor, an attendant placed commemorative photographs on the edge of the table. "These come with your package," he said. "Thank you," John and Deidre said in unison. John picked up the photographs and offered them to Deidre. "I believe these are yours?" Deidre took them and looked back at John. "There are 2. Wouldn't you and the girls like to have one?" "Yes, can we have one of them?" Amy asked. "Please," Emily added. John took the photograph Deidre offered and said, "That's very thoughtful of you." While Amy and Emily snatched at the one in John's hands, Deidre peered at hers. John leaned toward her to take a peek. They looked like the perfect family. It amazed him and made him feel guilty all at the same time. When Deidre, John, and the girls returned to Trump Tower, she exited the car with them, with the intent to walk around the corner to the embassy suites. She paused when Amy pointed at Helen sitting on the couch under the portico. Deidre followed John as he went straight to Helen, who stood as they approached. "Helen," John said, "is everything okay?" She nodded, and Deidre felt a measure of relief. "You weren't in your suites, so I waited here for you," she said. "The doctors say they'll release Philip from the hospital on Saturday, but he cannot travel for at least 7 days. She sucked in a breath and blew it out, as if she could expel her troubles with it. "Don't you worry about it," John said. "I will make sure your suite is extended for as long as you need it. I'll take the girls home on Monday as scheduled, and then I'll return for you and Philip in a week's time." "Oh, John, that's not necessary. We can take a commercial flight back home." "Nonsense," he said with killing stubbornness. "I brought you here, and I'll take you home." "You're very kind." Helen nodded and glanced over his shoulder, giving Deidre a smile. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin your evening." "You didn't ruin anything," Deidre said to Helen. "We had a lovely evening." She flashed a smile, first at the girls, then John. "I'd better be getting back to my hotel." She stepped back and gave John one last look before turning and walking away. "Deidre, wait!" John called after her. She stopped and glanced over her shoulder, waiting. John turned back to Helen. "Just one moment. I need to talk to her." "Oh, by all means. Why don't you walk her to her hotel?" Helen suggested. "The girls and I will wait right here for you." "Are you sure?" Helen nodded. "Go!" She pushed John toward Deidre. "It won't take long. She's staying next door at the embassy suites." "Take your time," Helen said. "I have no plans to go back to the hospital until tomorrow morning." John pointed at Amy and Emily. "I'll be right back." His tone issued an unmistakable warning. Be on your best behavior. John trotted after Deidre, his heart pounding against his chest. He felt like he had in high school when he trotted up the walkway leading to Robin Thompson's front door. He was a mess then, and he was a mess now. As John reached Deidre's side, he slowed to match her pace. "I hope we weren't too much of an intrusion on your evening. The girls and I, we had a great time." "Me too." Deidre waved the photo souvenir she was holding. "And I'll always have something to remember it by." "It was very kind of you to give us the spare," John said. "My children have grown quite fond of you." And so had John. "I've grown quite fond of them. They're wonderful children." They turned the corner and headed up Kalia Road toward the embassy suites. "I don't suppose you'd care for a nightcap?" He looked at her, hoping. "Will the kids be okay?" He nodded. "Helen's with them." Half an hour later, John and Deidre were sitting side by side at the Kanikapila Grill, a poolside bar across the street at the Outrigger Reef. John nursed his beer while Deidre sipped on a Mai Tai. "So you have no brothers or sisters?" He still found being an only child hard to fathom, considering the herd he came from. "No," Deidre shook her head. "But I often wonder what it would have been like if I'd had a sister or a brother." A lonely smile tipped the corners of her mouth as she wandered off into her own private thoughts. John would love to know what she was thinking, but the last thing he wanted to do was to cause her more sadness than she was already feeling. "Well, I have plenty," he said, "and you're welcome to any or all of them." Deidre's sad smile fell into laughter. "You know," she cleared her throat, and her tone undertook a sober quality, "my best friend in the whole world is the closest I'll ever come to having a sister." "So where is she?" John asked. "Why isn't she here with you?" "She's pregnant, 5 months, with twins." "Ah." John nodded. Sadness for Deidre washed over him. It must be awful to feel like you're all alone in the world. No family, no friends to accompany you on a mission to carry out your parents' last wishes. John had been feeling sorry for himself for the last 3 years, ever since Jessica's death. But as he sat there looking at Deidre, he realized he had it good. He had his children. He had more family than he liked at times, but they were his, and they were close. He had plenty of friends, many of whom had volunteered to come with him and the girls on this journey, but he'd felt like it was something that he and his children needed to do alone. Not had to do alone, just needed to. "If you come to Whisper Lake," he said, "after you meet the Sinclair bunch, they'll probably chase those what-if dreams of yours straight out the door." Even as he said it, John didn't believe it, but he'd do just about anything to cheer her up. Deidre sat there with a glazed-over look and remained silent for a moment. When she did speak, her voice trembled. "It's very kind of you to invite me for a visit." She said it like she thought he was just being nice. "I meant it." She looked at John, her gaze lingering a moment before she said, "I really should call it tonight, and you should probably let Helen get some rest." "She is probably exhausted." John nodded, then finger-tipped a 5 away from the change the bartender had placed on the bar next to his beer and stuffed the rest inside his pocket. "It would be my pleasure to walk you across the street, though." He stood and waited for her to move. When she did, he laid a gentle hand on the small of her back as they left the poolside bar. John felt a breathless fluttering in his stomach as they joined the flock of people milling along the sidewalk. "So you will go with us to the luau tomorrow night, right? The girls and I wouldn't have nearly as much fun without you." "I'd love to go." Deidre looked up at him. John thought he saw a hint of pink blushing on her cheeks. His heart danced. "What time?" John had booked transportation on a tour bus when he bought the luau tickets. He thought the girls might have fun with the tour guide. Then he remembered that Deidre hadn't cared for the bus ride she'd taken to get to the airport for the helicopter tour. He'd better rectify that. "I'll give you a call in the morning. I booked transportation on one of the tour buses, but I'll arrange for a car to take us to Paradise Cove." Deidre shook her head. "Don't go to any trouble on my account. The tour bus will be fine." "Are you sure?" he asked. "I can easily make other arrangements." "A tour bus ride with you, Amy, and Emily will be just fine." The smile accompanying her words made a believer out of John. Much too soon, John found himself standing alongside Deidre at the Embassy Suites entrance. "Well," she said, "this is my stop. Thank you for a wonderful evening." "The pleasure was all mine." John got caught up in her eyes, infinitely deep and as blue as the waters along the Waikiki shore. He was entranced. He wanted to kiss her, and his gut told him she wanted to be kissed. Then something inside him pushed him to go for it. He leaned down, moving slowly toward her. If she was going to object, she'd better hurry up and back away. But she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes. He followed her lead as his lips brushed against hers. The sensual softness of the kiss drew him in. He stepped closer and brushed his hand against her cheek. She opened her mouth a little more. John tangled his fingers in her hair as he kissed her long and deep and hard. When their lips parted, John's heart awakened from its long, lonely slumber and rumbled noisily up into his throat. Deidre let out a contented sigh. "I'll see you tomorrow?" she whispered in an almost questioning tone. "You can count on it." John gave her a wink and a smile before backing up a couple of steps, then turning and walking away. With a swagger in his step, John headed back to Trump Tower. His newly awakened heart was elated, and his hopes were soaring. But in the deep recesses of his mind was the lingering reminder of what he had to do on Sunday. Chapter 8. Deidre was glad John had reserved seats in the royal box. The last thing she wanted was to be close to the stage. Those were the people they brought up into the limelight, and Deidre hated the limelight. John had claimed the chair next to Deidre, while Amy and Emily were seated across the table from them. Deidre and the girls had ordered red lava flows, non-alcoholic versions for the girls, in souvenir glasses that reminded Deidre of the hurricane glasses she'd seen at Hard Rock cafes around the world. "Miss Deidre?" Emily seemed to be enjoying using her straw to poke new lava trails around in her beverage more than actually drinking it. "Will you really come to Whisper Falls to visit us?" "Your father has invited me," Deidre said, "and I think I just might do that." "Yay!" Emily clapped. Deidre glanced at John, wondering if he regretted the invitation. "If I'm still invited." "Of course you're still invited," John said with an eager nod. "For you, it's an open invitation. You can come whenever you like and stay as long as you want." Deidre's heart swelled. "I just might take you up on that. The only places I've ever been in Nevada are Tahoe and Vegas." "Then you definitely must come for a visit," John said. "Not to discredit Tahoe or Vegas, but there's more to our state than the tourist destinations." "It sounds like a wonderful place," Deidre said. Any place that had John Sinclair as a resident had to be wonderful. "It's boring." Amy rolled her eyes. "Amy, dear," John chuckled. "We're trying to convince Deidre to come, not chase her away." "Well, I suppose if you come," she said to Deidre, "it wouldn't be all that boring hanging out with you." Amy went silent for a moment as she scrutinized Deidre. Finally, her gaze slowly drifted to John. "Dad," once she had his attention, she continued, "I want to get some streaks in my hair, like Miss Deidre's." "Oh, I don't think that's going to happen," he said with sarcastic laughter. "Why not?" Amy asked. "I like your hair just the way it is. End of story." "Daddy, I have to go to the bathroom," Emily said. John looked at Amy. "Take your sister to the restroom." "But, Dad," Amy's voice filled with a whining quality that was not unfamiliar to Deidre. She'd used it often enough herself when she was a kid. Usually it got Deidre her way, and she wondered if it would work for Amy. Considering John's reaction, Deidre didn't hold out much hope. Amy pushed herself up and propped her hands on the table. "Please," she leaned toward John, "can I get some streaks?" "No!" A stern, almost scary quality invaded John's tone. Amy stomped off, dragging Emily with her. John shook his head. "Children." He looked at Deidre and chuckled. Deidre glanced in the direction Amy and Emily had gone off in. They disappeared into the crowd. Deidre looked back at John and shrugged. "What's the big deal?" she asked, studying his unsympathetic face. "It's not like it's going to have a permanent effect. It's just her hair. It will grow out." What's the big deal? It's just her hair? Anger rumbled through John. Wasn't she supposed to be on his side? Deep down he had known it from the get-go that letting Deidre Ferguson get under his skin was a bad idea. He already had enough trouble with Amy without bringing in reinforcements to back her up. Since when did Deidre have a right to an opinion when it came to his children? She was not their mother. John dropped his napkin onto his plate and cleared his throat. "Well, since your parenting skills have been tried and tested on how many children do you have again?" "No." Deidre shook her head. A distinct chill filled her voice when she added, "I don't have any children." She looked up at him with doleful misgivings. "But having been a young, impressionable girl myself once, I can tell you that under your circumstances, Amy just wants to feel like she's in control of something, anything." Deidre shrugged. "The fact that she wants it to be her hair, believe me, it could be much worse." She cut John a piercing glare. "And aside from that, you are teaching her to let a man control her, right down to the color of her hair." That stabbed a little, but she didn't understand. "I'm her father," he said to Deidre. "It's my right to control her hair if I want to. Jessica wouldn't have let him get away with that. But Jessica wasn't here, and John wasn't prepared to give Deidre, or any woman other than Jessica, a vote when it came to raising his children. If Deidre did come to Nevada, and if John did get involved with her, they were going to have to come to an understanding. The kids were off limits. Someday John might marry. He was still a young man, and he had needs. And let's face it, there weren't too many places in Whisper Falls where he could get his needs attended to without some form of commitment. So yeah, he could see himself marrying again, especially now that Deidre had awakened something inside him. Hell, he could even see it being Deidre. But when and if he did marry, his new wife, whoever she was, would have to understand. She was not, and never would be, Amy and Emily's mother, and therefore had no right to interfere with his parental decisions for his eldest children. The rest of the evening rolled along a little on the chilly side, even though the Hawaiian temperature lingered around the 80-degree mark. Deidre had clammed up. John tried to break the ice that was forming between the two of them, but every time he said something to her, she gave him nothing more than yes and no responses. She made no offer of encouragement to him, and gave no invitation for encouragement from him. Why was she so mad? Didn't she understand boundaries? He couldn't let another woman come in and replace Jessica like she'd never even existed. Deidre was beyond peeved. The nerve of John Sinclair! What an ass! It was just as well that she found out now what an unreasonable jerk he could be before she found herself in Nevada and hopelessly in love. She thought seriously about asking the staff to call for a taxi in the middle of the luau, but she couldn't bring herself to upset Amy and Emily by storming out. They'd been left enough as it was. Oh, sure, their mother couldn't help leaving them, but that hadn't made her disappearance from their lives any easier. Deidre knew that feeling all too well. When the luau came to an end, a measure of relief washed over Deidre, as she and everyone else began the slow procession toward the parking lot and to the buses. She lingered behind John and the girls, trying to put some distance between herself and them. She hadn't counted on Emily falling behind and latching onto her hand, though. Walking along with the little girl's hand in hers broke her heart a little. After tonight, Deidre would never see any of them again. At least that was her plan now that John had shown his true colors. Emily's gesture had made it impossible for Deidre to fall back as far from John as she'd like. But she didn't feel right about disappearing into the crowd with his daughter. While she wasn't exactly pleased with him right now, she didn't want to give him a heart attack either. John stopped at the open doorway of the bus and glanced over his shoulder. When his eyes met Deidre's, he gave her a worried smile. She did her best to remain stoic. The last thing she wanted to do was give John the satisfaction of knowing he'd hurt her feelings. Granted, she didn't know much about affairs of the heart, but she'd had some of the best teachers in the world. Her best friend, Lacey, and Lacey's sisters-in-law, Camille and Tasha. None of them would ever take that crap, and neither would Deidre. Deidre guided Emily onto the bus in front of her. John and Amy had taken window seats across the aisle from each other, while Emily claimed the aisle seat beside Amy. Deidre, however, stopped a few rows in front of them, looked down at an empty aisle seat, and asked the woman by the window, "Is this seat taken?" The woman waved at the seat. "Be my guest." Deidre sat down and fought the urge to glance over her shoulder to see John's reaction. After the bus rolled to a stop at the Aloha Landing bus depot at the Sheraton, once Deidre had stepped off, she waited for Amy and Emily. She couldn't care less about John, but she wouldn't walk away from them without a word. "Deidre?" John tried to spark up a conversation with her, but instead she turned to the girls. "Amy, Emily." She smiled to hide the hurt John had caused her. "Thank you so much for inviting me to tag along tonight. I had a wonderful time." She hugged each of them, hanging on tightly as unfamiliar feelings of wanting to be someone's mother washed over her. Unshed tears stung her eyes. "Well, I'd better be going." She forced a rigid smile in hopes of warding off the tears, at least until she'd turned her back on John. "Thank you again," she said to the girls, avoiding John's gaze. She could feel it boring into her. "You've made my trip so lovely." Deidre turned away from them and took off toward Kalia Road in the direction of the Beach Walk and Saratoga. "Just keep going," she coached herself. She was basically home free now that she'd walked away. John Sinclair might be the most divinely scrumptious man she'd ever met, at least until he'd shown his butt this evening, but she wasn't about to let him walk all over her. Lacey, Camille, and Tasha had taught her better than that. "Dad," Amy whispered softly as John stood there with his daughters, watching Deidre walk away. "Go after her." John looked at Amy. Was that really a good idea? Good idea or not, he found himself going after her. "Deidre," he called out. She stopped, but a few seconds passed before she looked over her shoulder. When she did, she sized him up and down as he closed the gap between them. "Deidre, I'm sorry if I offended you in any way." He hoped that would garner a smile from her, but it didn't. She didn't say anything, just stood there glaring at him. Her once sparkling blue eyes had turned cold and unfeeling. "Can we meet for breakfast tomorrow?" he asked, shocked at how fearful he was of being rejected. It took a moment before she cleared her throat, then said, "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "I have a ton of things to do tomorrow in preparation for my parents' service on Sunday." The tone of her voice stung as badly as her words. "If you'll excuse me." She didn't give him a chance to say anything else, at least not to her face. She simply turned and walked away. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he called after her. "I'm sorry." An hour later, with the girls tucked in their bed and watching TV, John retreated to the balcony overlooking Fort DeRussy Park and the ocean beyond. He leaned against the railing, letting his gaze meander over the scenery. Why had he snapped at Deidre about Amy's hair? She was right, after all. In the grand scheme of things, Amy's hair color, or colors, was of little consequence. But Deidre wasn't Amy's mother, and John still believed she had no say in the matter. To give her one would be disrespectful to Jessica's memory. John would never, could never do that. Even so, he regretted snapping at Deidre about it. Saturday morning, Deidre got up early and trekked over to Denny's at the corner of Kalia Road and Lewers Street. She'd thought about having breakfast at the Shorebird, but ultimately decided against it. She was afraid she'd run into John and the girls, and it was best if that didn't happen. The idea that she could step into this ready-made family had been a fantasy at best, and fantasies were best kept inside your head, back in the darkest recesses of your mind. She dined on a cheese omelet and home fries, eating in solitude. She made a note on her phone to cancel tonight's luau that she'd scheduled earlier in the week. She was glad she hadn't invited John and the girls to go with her, which she had fully intended to do last night, but hadn't gotten around to it before she and John had words. Deidre had to admit that John and his children had been a welcome distraction this week, and she had had fun in spite of herself, and that should make her parents happy, since they'd asked her to partake in a little fun before spreading their ashes. Deidre figured she had fulfilled their request, because she had enjoyed her time in Hawaii, right up until last night. Things were back to normal now, though. Or at least they would be, because Deidre was once again alone, just as she always would be from here on out.
Let's face it, she told herself. Some people were meant to be alone.
She was one of them. After breakfast, she headed back to the hotel, wondering what she could do, where she could go, to ensure that she wouldn't run into John and the girls today. She was on an island, though, which narrowed the odds considerably. Inside the embassy suites, Deidre stepped into the elevator behind an elderly couple. They got off on the 4th floor. Her phone chimed as the doors slid closed. She looked at the display. John. She rejected the call. When the lift opened on the 8th floor, Deidre exited and headed down the hallway toward her room. She barely had time to get the door open before her phone jingled again. Stepping inside the room, she huffed and glanced at the display. Amy. Her first inclination was to reject the call. It was probably John anyway. It'd serve him right for using his daughter to get to her. She laid her phone on the table. It was still ringing. What if it was Amy? Guilt rained down on Deidre. She snatched up the phone and accepted the call.
Hello, Miss Deidre.
Amy's voice poured out.
Amy?
Deidre said into the phone, as if she wasn't sure who was on the other end of the call. She was, though. She was simply buying time to find a graceful way out, and one that wouldn't hurt Amy's feelings.
Yes, it's me, Amy said. I just wanted to tell you how much I've enjoyed meeting you. And him, too. We'll never forget you.
Oh, John Sinclair, Deidre thought. You played dirty. Very dirty.
I'll never forget you either, Amy, Deidre said into the phone. You and your sister have made me realize what's missing in my life. I'll always be grateful for that.
Deidre sucked in a breath to impede her blind, unreasoning desire to cry.
Unfortunately, I've got to get going. I'm late for an appointment.
She felt a measure of guilt over lying to Amy, but it was for the best. This conversation did not need to continue until Deidre was practically sobbing on the phone.
Do you want to talk to my dad before you go?
Amy asked hopefully.
No,
Deidre said softly.
I think your dad and I have said all there is to say. Will you still come see us?
Amy asked.
Amy, you and I are always going to be friends. You have my number. Please call or text me any time you want.
The pain of what those words actually meant caught in Deidre's throat. She tried to clear it out, without much luck, before adding,
I'll always be anxious to hear from you. Same goes for Emily.
Deidre ended the call just as the tears spilled over from her eyes. Why, oh why, had she let herself get so wrapped up in John Sinclair? Now her heart was broken, and as far as she could see, there was no way to mend it.